Hello, today I wanted to go over VOO and VTI and help you potentially decide which might be right for you. So, first of all, it's good to get an understanding of what VOO and VTI actually are. Both are ETFs that are issued by Vanguard. And what that basically means is that both are these collections or baskets of stocks. This helps consumers like us buy lots of stocks without having to sort or look through lists of different stocks. We can buy hundreds, maybe even thousands of stocks with just one ETF. So VOO is an ETF that tracks the S&P 500. What this means is it looks at the 500 biggest companies in the US stock market. It's a collection or basket of these 500 stocks based off their weighting. That means companies like Apple are the highest weighted in the ETF, and companies like, say, Target would be a lower weighting because it's a smaller company. VTI is a total stock market ETF, which means it tracks the entire US stock market. And that means that every stock that is in VOO, the S&P 500, is also in VTI. But VTI also has smaller companies that make up the stock market. So while VOO has about 500 companies, VTI has thousands of companies. Here we can see the performance of these two ETFs compared, and you can see that they are almost identical. These two funds are basically identical, and honestly, you can't go wrong with owning either one of them. They're both great ETFs. If we go back a bit further and look at the 1 year performance, you can see that VOO has a slight edge over VTI. And as we go back to 5 years, that slight edge increases, and 10 years, it increases even more. The reason this is happening is because VOO is focused on the S&P 500, which has slightly outperformed the total stock market over the past 10 years. So the 500 biggest companies are basically performing better in recent history compared to the smaller cap companies that VTI has in it, which is why you see slight outperformance. But honestly, these two funds are almost identical. Even after 10 years, the difference is 20%, which when you're looking at a 209 versus 229% return is not all that much. But it could be important to you depending on how much you're investing and what you're looking for in terms of returns. So it's still good to take that into account. And then if we look at dividends, again, this is extremely similar. You have VOO with 1.36 and VTI with 1.35. So the slight edge goes to VOO in this category, but honestly, this again is a very minuscule difference and doesn't mean a whole lot. And if we look at the expense ratios, this is how much per year you pay to Vanguard in order to run and make sure that the ETF is working properly, basically. So this is a fee, so you want it to be as low as possible. And both of these have 0.03%. That means if you had $1,000 in VOO or VTI, you would have to pay Vanguard 3 cents a year, which is not that much, and it's on the very low end of ETFs. So these are both extremely good in terms of expense ratio. So when it comes to VOO or VTI, which one is right for you? It really depends on what you're looking for in terms of diversification. So if you want exposure and you want those smaller companies and you think, oh, maybe the smaller companies are going to start outperforming, or you just want that safety in case smaller companies start outperforming or larger companies start underperforming, VTI gives you more diversification, and it's sort of, I would say, is a little bit less risky because it's less concentrated into those major companies. But on the other hand, if you think that the S&P 500 is going to continue to outperform into the future, and you think those 500 biggest companies are going to continue their slight outperformance and you want those 500 companies and don't feel as bullish on the smaller cap stocks in the market, then VOO might be right for you. But honestly, owning both these funds is perfectly fine. I see some like financial people say that like you shouldn't have multiple funds that are basically identical. So like you shouldn't have VOO or SPY. You should consolidate into one of those, and you shouldn't have 2, 3, 4, a dozen different S&P ETFs. But honestly, it's perfectly fine to have multiple. You can have VOO and VTI at the same time. It's not going to hurt your returns at all. I think most of the reason why people say this is just because it makes your portfolio kind of cluttered, and maybe they don't like looking at tons of different S&P ETFs in their portfolio, but it doesn't hurt your performance. As long as they all have like the same fee ratio, then you're perfectly fine. Like that's the one thing to look out for, is make sure that when you're picking an S&P 500 ETF that the fees are low. They should be around this 0.03%, because these are some of the best in the market in terms of low fees. So yeah, you can't go wrong. Owning both of these is perfectly fine. I own both VOO and VTI. I remember when I first started investing, I mainly bought VOO because it was talked about a lot more and I knew about it, and I only found out about VTI later. But now I buy both of them, and I'm probably buying mostly VTI just because it has that extra exposure and I value that over the slightly increased returns, which is backwards looking at the S&P 500 companies over the last 10 years. So who knows what's going to happen in the next 10 years. Regarding the whole indecisiveness between picking stocks and ETFs, this was a sort of issue that I had because I spent about 2 years where I wanted to get into the stock market, but I didn't really know where to start. And I kind of just sat on the sidelines and watched, and I missed out on a lot of returns because I wasn't willing to choose a stock or an ETF and really get my hands dirty, sort of. So I would say if you're between these two funds, either of them is a great choice, and I would just make the decision. You can even buy both if you're unsure. I hope you learn more about VOO and VTI, and thanks for watching. Bye.